Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the this edition of Thinking Aloud. And I'm joined today by Doug Johnson. If some of you thought you might be seeing Oliver Lowry, my apologies, but we had to. Oliver couldn't make it, so Doug has very kindly just agreed to step in. I've got an introduction here, Doug, by the way, so I'm going to read for you. And to introduce you, and then we can sort of get into the meat of it. As you probably know, that if you've been on one of these before, Thinking Aloud is really where we explore the power of creative thinking and in construction and in business. And Doug, founder and managing director of Mesh Energy, or just Mesh as most of us know it. He's a chartered mechanical engineer, educator, author, and someone who's been quietly and consistently ahead of the curve when it comes to sustainable energy in buildings. Doug set up Mesh Energy. I'm sure we'll hear more about this later on, but to help clients navigate the increasingly complex challenge of designing and delivering low energy buildings, taking a holistic first principles approach to energy saving and performance. So he's, over a long career, he's covered everything from bespoke homes, large scale commercial developments, and it's still Doug's mindset that stands out: part engineer, part educator, part entrepreneur. Mesh is a B Corp certified consultancy. It's trusted by developers known as architects and specifiers to offer impartial advice and whole building strategies. So he's also the author of a book called Right First Time, which is a practical guide aimed at architects, helping them to reduce risk and deliver low energy buildings with clarity and confidence. Doug's real gift is translating complexity into insight without dumbing it down. So it's a simpler, not dumber approach, whether through client workshops, project support, this channel, which is Mesh hosted, his book. So he's championed decision-making and collaboration right the way through. That's one of the common threads. So today, Doug, I hope we're going to cover a whole range of views on this, see if we can give people some practical advice and some insights on how you ended up where you are. So let's kind of get straight into it. Welcome. And
hi, folks. Thanks for showing up.
I'm not sure how many people on this call or who listen to this will come across you, but for the benefit of everybody concerned, let's just start with the journey. So tell us where you came from. You started as a mechanical engineer, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I did A levels. I did university, and I studied as a mechanical engineer at Brunel University, and then did a master's. My dad was an engineer, so it was something that I kind of naturally was encouraged to do, and then spent a few years being an engineer, and got an opportunity within the renewable energy space, and that was my last, I guess, formal as by training, engineering role, and from then on. I was a project manager and started running a design team using that mechanical education I'd been given at university. But yeah, then started cutting my teeth in the wider renewable energy services industry. That was for an installer where I was working there. And then 5 or 6 years after that, a short stint doing solar, these big kind of solar PV farms for city institutions. And then decided to clear the decks and start again my own consultancy, which was Mesh, and that was back in kind of sole trader, being kind of around about 2013.
So what? I mean, obviously, you're now involved in sustainability, very heavily involved in sustainability. So, when you started, how did people view sustainability as first of all as a concept, but more importantly as a business? Where did you begin to spot the business opportunity for what might be called a sustainable business, or a business involved in sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I mentioned, when I started, not with Mesh, but the business before, a couple of businesses before, around actually installing products. I mean, I was lucky enough to be introduced to the world of sustainability or renewable energy, whatever you want to call it, back in 2008, right? And it really was a very, very foreign concept. And more forward-thinking entrepreneurs than me had seen there was an opportunity importing stuff from Germany, for example, that had been, other parts of Europe and Scandinavia have been well ahead of the sustainability curve beyond the UK. And they were importing this equipment in and then, speaking to forward-thinking architects, to people who had, wealthier clients who had money to spend on these kinds of things. So I actually saw at a grassroots level that people were prepared to pay for, install, and use this equipment. I wasn't really kind of aware of the kind of the consultancy space at that point, but I knew there was a demand. This was up actually in Norfolk and Suffolk, where this company was doing a lot of its business. So I saw people actually, wanting to embrace this technology. And for me, that's the acid test, right? I mean, you can talk about this stuff, but ultimately these people were parting with fairly significant chunks of money, and taking a bit of a flyer and not putting in gas boilers and instead, putting in whatever a ground source heat pump was.
So
and even they thought it was a bit of a black art, 2 decades ago.
I mean, this kind of thinking really intrigues me, because when you come to explain to somebody the business case of this, not only are you talking about something that could be perceived as a luxury item, but it's also it would generally be perceived as risky. Now,
Yeah.
we could talk about what the definition of risk is, but I'm intrigued about how were you uncovering clients? What was motivating these clients to make a decision with you to do something
Yeah, I mean, that
could
was a
be
good
perceived
question.
as a risky luxury expense?
Yeah, again, so this was before I set up Mesh, but actually, what and I did learn from this, I think, actually, and this is actually why I set up Mesh. So this is the kind of the pre-runner to before we set up Mesh Energy. But actually, the reason that people were buying, as you rightly said, what could be perceived as a risky choice rather than sticking with a gas boiler that people have understood for a long, long time, and oil technology and things like that, was, I mean, there was a big element of salesmanship to it. And I think that in some respects created issues in its own right. This was before there were grants for ground source heat pumps, so you couldn't even get X thousands of pounds from the government to help you, afford these things. I was working with an entrepreneur who was an incredible salesperson, and like selling sand to the Arabs, right? All of us on this call will have met a salesperson who they buy something and they just don't know how they've got to that point. And it is a real skill, and that is fantastic. But in my particular case, this entrepreneurial figure and this awesome salesperson, they were after the sale, and they hadn't really understood whether that was actually the right solution for that particular setting, client, a whole list of other things. And so it was very kind of
Did you have many
sales.
complaints?
Yeah. Yes. And again, this is a pre-runner to where my mind was at. These were very, very formative years before I set up Mesh Energy. And yeah, it was really unfortunate in many respects, because some of the mistakes were, you did see, to a degree, you saw an element of regret from the client that this wondrous technology and its implementation and what it could do wasn't meeting up what had been sold to them. Now, that's not to say that the technology was bad at all, but we were selling product. The company that I was working with was selling product. Yes, we were doing designs, working with the manufacturers, but there wasn't this holistic thinking around whether that was the right solution.
Well, I think that's a key point, because I think part of this is selling sustainability, isn't it? I mean, I'm always intrigued to know what people's definition of sustainability is. I mean, there are standard definitions of
Yeah.
sustainability, which we
Yeah.
we all come across. But in terms of the buyer, in terms of the customer facing this, you obviously have people who are motivated by a range of topics, which you obviously saw the commercial opportunity at some stage. So I'm intrigued by the motivation, because I think you're right. There are elements where people can be sold to, and of course the other thing about that is that if the customer that you're talking to, or the client you're talking to, has a very weak grasp of the technical specification of the product, and why would they have a good grasp of it necessarily? Then on what terms are you selling to somebody? And so the sustainability side of it. I mean, you look back now, so we're going back to the 80s, so we're going back 30 years, okay, something like that, although to when this people's understanding of what sustainability must have been completely different then to what it is now. It's a whole industry now.
Yeah, and ever growing.
So that was it. So what were you spotting in that? Were you that then said to you, hang on a minute, there's a business in here?
Yeah, so this is so I was partaking in the business which was putting in ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps, underfloor heating. They were heating and hot water solutions, but we were very much at the product sales end. So we knew we made a 30% margin. If we could sell something for £10,000, we make 3,000, and you just convince as many people as possible to put these things in. And it wasn't quite as cold as that, but we were there to sell product.
Who was specifying these products? Were you involved in the
specification? We were. Yeah, we were specifying the products. Yeah, designing the products. I ran the design team. I was a commissioning engineer, and helping the team deliver it and working with plumbers and things like that. But the shortcome came in, and again, this is why I kind of set up Mesh Energy, and not necessarily because the definition of sustainability changed, but in my mind, and having taken a bit of a step back and a breather, I needed to properly believe that clients would, if they're going to spend the hard-earned money, they need to be spending it on the right solution. And fundamentally, there just wasn't enough knowledge, enough technical knowledge, enough more holistic understanding of the kind of the nuances that went into these kinds of things in order to specify the right solution. And where Mesh Energy started out was in high-end houses, almost like grand designs type homes. And so from a product installer side, we're not acting on behalf of the client. Whatever you say, you're trying to shift product when you're installing product. I wanted to set up a business that essentially was a client's buddy, worked with the architect and the client. But we're getting paid by the client for Mesh Energy. So I wanted to be that little angel sat on the client's shoulder to say, look, given all the information, given your budget, given what you care about, this is what you should be doing. Forget what you're being sold, forget what's being pushed on you, forget what you think you should do based on information, data, what is important to you. We're going to help you figure out what is the right solution, what's the smartest thing to do here.
I mean, that's an intriguing point. We'll come on to data later on, because it's one of the things which I picked up in the book that you've written in your book. The other thing that intrigued me about this at the time is that how many of the houses reflected the same sustainability criteria as the unkindly put bling that you were putting on it. Because I'm fairly sure that if I remember back, there are plenty of occasions when people are putting renewables onto houses where actually what they should be doing first is the insulation or the air tightness, and they're looking at they're not, the fabric comes second.
Yeah, and we did see that. A lot of the work that we were doing was for new build buildings, or in fact massive renovations in Norfolk and Suffolk. There was a big trend there to do barn conversions. So farmers had these derelict barns, and it was pretty easy for them to get planning to convert them into houses and then either sell them off or do whatever with them. But yeah, I mean, with new build, the easy thing is, well, if it meets the new build regulations, they're generally speaking going to be better than what was there before. And so there's not really an issue. So certainly when we were product installers, we didn't really kind of care about that. That was the architect's problem to kind of work that out, right? We just made sure that you had a big enough boiler or heat pump that would kind of fit into that. But that then really changed when, with Mesh Energy in its kind of early days, we were acting on behalf of the client. So it wasn't jumping to specifying a product. It was doing that other understanding. Yeah,
I mean, it's an intriguing point, isn't it? Because I think that for those of us, I mean, certainly with eco-merchant, sorry, excuse me. Obviously we sit between, on one hand, on our left-hand side, we've got people manufacturing and suppliers of products. On our right-hand side, we've got customers who want to buy them. And the weight of training in terms of product knowledge and information is weighted towards the supplier. So all the suppliers have fully trained technical staff and salespeople. And on the right-hand side, there's less of it. And I think one of the things that intrigues me is that it seems to me that you positioned yourself as effectively training people to buy. so you were making them more aware. I mean, would that be, is that part of the, would that be fair as part of
Yeah,
the
I
business
think,
model?
yeah, and from a very early stage, I genuinely believed that what I knew, if a client came to me for advice, I should share, I mean, not share everything that I knew, but based on their situation, based on what they were looking at, what's the whole point in holding back that information or mistakes that I'd kind of made there and saving them a whole load of hassle. There's a great slide that I use in some of the presentations that I use, which is a mouse with a hard hat on in a room full of mouse traps. And I think that's a fantastic analogy for, you know, I'm just going to say a kind of a homeowner here, but even professionals in the sector, that there are there are so many things that can go wrong, and so many things that can trap your finger or blow your leg off or anywhere in between. That clients do need pathfinders to help them through
Well,
that buying decision,
I
and
think,
and customers have got more discerning. They have done that, and it's great because the industry gets held more accountable for what it's trying to push on those who are spending their hard-earned money.
well, I mean,
I think that's a great place to be.
you know my opinion from when we've chatted before about it was Nassim Taleb's definition of an expert is someone who takes full accountability. You shouldn't describe yourself as an expert if you're not fully accountable for the consequences of your decision. But it intrigues me. This is because I think a lot of this is, to me, I'm quite often looking for the point where the data, the science begins to end, and then other factors begin to influence what happens. And it seems to me that Mesh Energy is sitting between, it works on both sides of the line. The data will get you so far, but then you can find the customer doesn't do it for a reason that you think is maybe not very sensible. They just say, oh, we're not going with it. I don't know, we don't like them, we don't this, that, and the other. We see this as well with really simple things. You can do as much work as you like developing a new product, but you might have a customer that buys from one person and not another simply because they can get credit there. And that will change the way things work. So but I wanted to just bring it back to this sort of sustainability. And you were saying customers becoming more discerning. What were they becoming more discerning about?
I think because sustainability and heat pumps and these things are, we're being flooded with every day. There's so much press about it. There's nightmare stories in the Telegraph and the Times about, I spent my life savings on this and now, my energy bill's like 10 times what it was. I mean, there's like any press, there's like ridiculous stuff in there. And we're just kind of getting bombarded with information. And so we're getting bombarded with information. And as a result, just through osmosis, people pick up stuff, and some of it's good, some of it's bad, some of it's in the middle somewhere. And customers do care more about this. Again, there's a great saying. I think everybody would love to be green as long as it was free, right? We have this kind of, as long as it didn't cost us anything, we'd love all to be net zero carbon and regenerative this and regenerative that. But it costs us money, right? And we understand that there are compliance pressures. There are, you have to start paying kind of fees and penalties if you're not sustainable, and whether you run a business or your house or, gas is getting more expensive. So in its own right, there are penalties for staying on fossil fuels. So people are looking around and being educated just by absorbing stuff within the press. And that just leads to more questions. As we know more, as we are exposed to more, we ask more questions. And I mean, this is a whole nother like psychology of the way that the world is going. But whilst some people take things at face value, I think there are more and more people who are critical, particularly when it means that they've got to dig into their pocket and pay more money than they would do to, say, replace a gas boiler or something like that.
I think it was Richard Thaler who's basically was the founder of behavioral economics way back I think it was in the early 70s. Who basically said, and I'm just going to summarize it, just sort of basically said, if you give people difficult questions to answer, what they tend to do is to answer an easy question to resolve that problem. And one of the easy questions to resolve is, does it save me any money? Yeah. Is it cheaper? Okay. And so that avoids you having to go through any kind of value assessment where you're required to do some work. It's system 1 and system 2, isn't it? It's a sort of more reactive response rather than a considered response. So, I mean, so it intrigues me as well, because I think we're all involved, and everybody listening to this and us as well, we're all involved in this great game of persuasion.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the discerning comment is an interesting one to me, because if we could find out what people wanted to be discerning about, we could generally offer them better solutions to the problems that they may or may not know that they're going to encounter. And this would be external to the existing drivers of things like increasing fuel costs or heating costs. I think it does boil down to this to a lot. So how did that approach that you've just described, how did that orientate your Mesh Energy? Because I'm kind of heading towards your book, really, because the book that you've written has a whole section on methodology and thinking. You've kind of put this down in a logical order. So was this all of this discerning stuff? This is what you eventually managed to write down in the book. All of this.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, there is just to kind of take a step back to what you were saying. People love when stuff gets cheaper. Unfortunately, things are getting more expensive, and particularly in trying to, decarbonize the UK or lessen our impact. However you want to call sustainability or that drive to net zero, however you want to frame it, you don't get there by spending less money. Like anything, you have to invest money for the long-term benefit, and that's 99 times out of 100 that is true in any walk of life. So if in our minds we frame this as, right, we accept we have to spend more money, both personally or as businesses or as nations or whatever, if you get over that and lean into it, the question then becomes, how do I spend that money? If I have to spend it, or should I say invest it, how do I invest that the smartest way possible? Nobody wants to waste money. So if I have to spend £100, how do I make that £100 make a bigger difference if I spend it in this particular way than if I spend £100 and it makes a much smaller difference because I've spent it in another way? And fundamentally, and this comes back to me with my kind of logical engineering brain and just, the way that I, generally speaking, when I'm being rational in my own life, spend my money, which is, let's be clever about this. Let's just spend a bit more time understanding the setting, what the options are, and if necessary, ask somebody's help. Don't be afraid of doing that. And then figure out how I can make this finite amount of money go the furthest. And, your nod to the book there, fundamentally, that's what the book is about.
But don't you think we save differently? If I'm saving up for a holiday, I'm going to be more liberal with my spending with that money than if I'd saved it up to buy something else, something to pay my gas bill. Okay,
correct.
I have a different approach to this as well. And I suppose the other thing which I really like, which I've used a lot, and I know you've heard me say this before, but which was Kumar Galhotra's comment when he was president of Lincoln, which is manufacturing cars. This was in the States. He said that manufacturing cars is 100,000 logical decisions in search of one emotional one. and we kind of get to this. There isn't this perfect link between utility and value that people see. So that, to my mind, if you could move people into the position of treating this money as they would compartmentalize their other savings, then it diminishes the problem, because actually, where's this price anchored? It costs more than what?
Exactly.
So that anchorage point is the bit where, if you could move that anchorage point somewhere else, then you might even be saving them money. And then lastly on that, which I just want to tie in, because I think this is interesting about how Mesh's approach works, is status signaling. I mean, I suppose a good example would be Tesla. Up until about a year ago or 6 months ago, owning a Tesla was definitely a status symbol, far more expensive than any other electric car in the market.
Yeah.
Now that Musk has done what he's done, people are getting rid of their Teslas.
It's another signal.
So the fragility in that pricing, the status, the car's the same. It's just the message that goes with it and the association. So when you're talking to people about this, does this express itself as a resistance to change? Is that what it comes? Because you're explaining that you're coming up against it. So when you're doing this, how do you communicate this? How do you re-anchor them somewhere else? So
I think there is resistance to change. I've been resisting change for well over a decade. And
believe when you had hair, Doug.
Believe me, we see far less resistance today than I did when I set off with a laptop and trying to talk to architects about something they hadn't even had a client talking to them about. So, how do we frame that? I always come back to, and this is a nod to what you were saying here. People spend money differently based on, in their mind, what they're spending their money on. So they're on holiday. This is pleasure, right? So people will spend a lot of money on pleasurable stuff. People are not going to spend a lot of money on, I don't know, some sheets of plasterboard and maybe some bricks or some insulation you never see. They will do, but they're certainly not going to proportionally spend more money than on a holiday, for example. So what I always came back to, and again, it's that psychology of it, is the question I always used to ask people is, when all the builders have gone home, all the dust has settled, you've written all the checks to whoever you need to write money to, and this may have been, I'm talking to them, before they've even got planning for their project. When the project's finished, what's your definition of success here? What do you want to be left with? And most people, out of all the answers that I got, there were 2 or 3 key answers. One is a better living environment for my family, because it's a home that we're going to be staying in. So I want a more comfortable space for me, my son, my daughter, and maybe grandchildren to live in. One very similar to that was, some kind of form of legacy. But the other big one was, I don't want to be spending a lot of money running this house compared to what it would be in my previous one that I've been living in. So again, they may be spending their life savings spending money, but the actual end result that matters to them is they've got let's pick a number, another £1,000 a month to spend on their quality of life rather than their gas bill or their electricity bill. And so having got whatever that 1 or 2 kind of key things from them was, then you can kind of backtrack. And I think rather than just saying, oh, well, we're an energy consultancy, how can we write this report for you? You care about what they want to be left with, and you can start walking back and unpacking that conversation in a reverse order, and invariably comes back to practical steps.
Do you think there's status involved in this? Do you think, because I know a couple of people who built self-builds, and they're enormously proud of them, rightly so. And it is a status thing. Come and look at our lovely house, and that I don't know how you put a value on that easily.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think for some it is. I think, particularly when we were doing kind of grand designs type properties and earlier doors, that was definitely the case. I think less so nowadays, but you have people with kind of technological backgrounds that see huge kudos, and it's almost a challenge to themselves as to how smart they can make their building and what they can put in and coefficients of performance and all the kind of the techie stuff. But I think increasingly, there's still people who want to do the right thing and know that their building, is a kind of a lighter touch than a similar building previously. There's a real mix still.
I'm really intrigued with this, because when I look, especially with architects and architects' websites, I have my own personal views, which I'll probably hold back on case studies. But when I look at architects' websites, generally speaking, most architects' websites are beautifully done. They're really enjoyable, real estate to look at. And then you'll see our projects or look at our views. when you look at those, what you tend to look at is it carries with it an impression. And normally there's a sort of read more button, and then there's a whole bunch of technical detail. There'll probably be some blurb that says, this fabulous, this, that, and the other, or won an award, if that'll be at the top. But it intrigues me about what people actually think if they're looking at a website that does have these things on, what their mind is actually telling them. Because, I think people have an expectation sometimes. If a building looks in a certain way, then the occupants are likely to be this kind of person with these kind of, lifestyle sort of features to their lifestyle. And I think that, there's something a little bit more prosaic going on here as well, because a lot of this that drives us, because we're an employee-owned business, and we're like many of the people who will be listening to this in an ethical business. Actually, do you know what? We should be doing this for everyone. This shouldn't just be the preserve of, this shouldn't be the luxury that is. No. So when it kind of brings me on to this other bit, which it sort of drags out here, which is about working with a wider group of stakeholders. So I think you've got two key things going on here, really, which I'd be interested to hear you to expand on. One is the language you use, because if you're talking from concept to keys on a building, when somebody's walking in, the person who's being given the keys will not understand the person at concept if they spoke their own language. Yeah. And the other thing, I suppose, is ambition and exit, because we play our part. I sometimes describe this like Space Invaders, if anybody's old enough to remember that, where you've got a little gun at the bottom and things start transferring across the screen. We don't know what's coming as a merchant from the left, and we know that we've lost it by the time, if we don't do our bit, by the time it leaves the screen. So contextually, they can work in silos. And if you do, then you have your own ambitions and your own exit. My job is to supply this, get out with this profit, without really paying any attention to the consequence it might have on the whole. Yeah. So those two things, the language that's used and the ambition and exit, you've addressed that. That's really fundamental to the way your business approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
so talk to me about how you do that, how you solve those.
So this is something that comes probably a bit more naturally to me personally, and so I've looked, as I've built the team, looked for similar team members that can do the same kind of thing. But your first observation there about the spectrum of people that you come across through design, construction, the clients who are paying for it and have somewhat of a kind of a vision there. It is huge, and then you've got technicians, and you've got people could go into like 4 decimal places because that's what they love and that's where they sit. And as a consultancy practice, to be a successful one, we're a people business. Every business within reason is a people business, but we certainly are. And so, this ability to be a chameleon in any situation and very, very quickly adapt to the person you're speaking to, where they see the value in the conversation and where they're at from an educational point of view, is absolutely key. And it's almost like a sixth sense. And of course, based on how the conversation's going, that's what you have to adapt to. So you have to be adaptive all the time so that you can properly, some of the nuances of what we're talking about. And we talked about persuasion and resistance to change. Or even resistance to new ideas or concepts. You would explain that and walk people through that completely differently based on, what the type of stakeholder was. So you have to be adaptive all the time. I see plenty of people failing because they can only communicate their idea or their reasoning in one particular way. And that'll work for 1 out of 50 people. But the problem is they need to be convincing 25 people to really ensure they continue with the project and continue driving value.
That's where the data, I'm not alone in this, but I used to worry when I worked in the corporate world, if somebody pitches up with spreadsheets, I just think, oh shit, I'm lost, because I was in the marketing side of it. And I think that this sort of rather unfortunate trend of allowing data to determine behavior absolutely is a worry. Because it intrigues me because I suppose we ought to come on to this a bit, but you also went through the process of the B certification, didn't you, to become B
Yeah.
Corp? And part of one of the essential things in B Corp is about collaborative working. It's about openness and collaborative working.
Mm.
And so you're tying together a group of people who will have specific. I mean, it would be lovely to think, wouldn't it? An architect would be employed to design a project to a customer brief and then run through the whole project, work with all the participants all the way through. But that doesn't necessarily happen. Certainly, it doesn't happen in domestic architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the communication thing is absolutely key. And did that inform the process of B Corp certification? Because it's fairly rigorous.
Yeah,
I think you learn
it
something
is
from the process,
rigorous.
don't you?
Yeah, we didn't take that decision lightly. I think, as I mentioned, on a previous call, we were looking at like ISO standards, for example. You've got ISO 9001, ISO 14001, all those kinds of things. But actually, I've only got a finite amount of time to spend on these kinds of things. We've got to still keep earning money and looking for, prospecting and doing those kinds of things. So, we did talk to the wider team about this, but we thought it would make sense to do something harder hitting and more holistic, if you want to use that word. So if we were going to get an accreditation, we'd like it to ring a lot of the bells and pluck a lot of the strings that cover the full breadth of the business, rather than just going for technical competency, for example, or a sustainability standard. And the B Corp thing was still in its kind of early days. We've been B Corp certified. This is our 4th year, so we've gone in for our 2nd accreditation. They do accreditation every 3 years. And it just kind of made sense. Again, this kind of comes back to me as the founder. For a long, long time, and this was when Philip Green was being hauled through the courts for ripping off all of his pension funds and having to eventually kind of pay it back and stuff. It was the kind of the antithesis of what B Corp is about, and understanding that they're, a profitable, healthy, fantastic business can't be an ethical one. It can't be a responsible one. It can't be one that cares it's for its staff. It can't be one that's transparent about its numbers. They're not mutually exclusive.
They're dead right about that. I mean, there is an understandable, a completely understandable cynicism of big business and claims for ethical trading and ethical behaviour when they don't exist, or when evidence to the contrary exists. So was that the element of B Corp? I mean, there is an element of B Corp that you were thinking actually, if we're going to have a badge, this is a bloody good one to have.
Yeah, I mean, it was, we decided to kind of pin our collars to the mast there. I mean, funnily enough, we got B Corp certified, but before the likes of Ecology and Gusto and, and a load of other big brands. And we didn't do that to be an early adopter. It was something which already was a globally recognized thing.
Do you ever get asked for it, or do you think it makes a difference when you're looking at tenders, or when you're doing with a PQQ for something where people are looking for the certifications?
Honestly, I'm not sure we've ever won a piece of work just because we're B Corp certified. However, there is no doubt that as you move into the bigger projects, particularly with other big brands, that's a real barrier to entry to getting on some much bigger projects. Invariably, they've got a board of directors they need to impress, and they've got various CSR, corporate and social responsibility boxes that they've got to tick. But even my brother-in-law, I mean, he came to me. They haven't got an accreditation like this for their business, and they were trying to do stuff with the BBC and other well-known UK brands. And they weren't even getting off the starting line unless they had some kind of framework that they were doing business within. So I haven't seen a massive impact within the construction sector yet. Luckily, that wasn't the only reason that I did it. But it will come, and it just shows whether you win work or not. I think it does, for the wider brand, show a commitment to doing something that isn't just about profit.
I think you're right.
Spending time and effort.
Yeah, I think it's also the process. I think if anybody's looked into B Corp, And they've looked at what you have to go through. Just the process itself of going through it means that you've got a sort of internal discipline that says, we've had
That's exactly it.
ourselves
Internal discipline. You're holding yourself to a particular standard. Nobody's, you know, nobody's prodding you to do that, and that tells you something about that business, and that's again what I would like to think that represents when somebody sees that we've gone through that once they fully understand what's involved.
I think it's like a dissertation at university, isn't it? Which is, it's actually, I think AI probably got a lot to answer for here, but certainly when I was, and I went to college, not university, because I studied farming, but when I did my thesis, actually, when I look back, it was the process of doing it. It was all the research and all the information that I had to gather, the way of working out what to write, the order and everything else. I can only just remember what I wrote it on. Okay. But I think the process, I think my lecturers at the time probably valued the process more than the outcome. And I think some of that must relate to B Corp. So that's another question that I wanted to ask you about, was about complexity and resolving complexity.
Yeah.
And so compliance, delivery, integration, meeting the client's needs. And I mean, quite often people see this, or it either see it or it becomes a barrier to building a better building. Let's call it a more sustainable building. Is that, I think that's a fairly common experience for all of us, isn't it? That happens is, oh, no, we'll just do it the other way because it's all too bloody.
Yeah.
And we can't do it.
Yeah.
So how do you go about, have you got any little tricks and tips? Well, I know you have because I've read your book. But have you got any little tricks or tips about how you break down that complexity and make it more manageable for people?
Yes, I mean, I was thinking about this, and really, there's a couple of key factors here, and this is where we see kind of success when people lean into this and actually do it. And this is what we've tried to bake into the systems when we're within Mesh, and people are always mad keen to get going. Everybody's got a deadline. Everybody's got a looming, oh, we want to try and get this done in 3 months, in 6 months, and this, that, and the other. And I get that because time is money. So normally, the longer something goes on, the longer it costs you money. But where we see projects that are really committed to overall success, it's really about proper planning. And again, this comes back to data. It comes back to understanding your options before you pick one. But, there are very, very few projects that I see with decent project managers on them, for example. Sadly, a good project with a good project manager stands out. There are lots of projects that are run by very, very mediocre and very, very poor project managers.
What makes them mediocre, and what makes them mediocre? What's the difference between a good one and a bad?
In my humble opinion, they can't get their head around the complexity of modern day construction and the stakeholders in the way that they need to, and they're often kind of run roughshod over by other team members. They fail in really showing, like any other people you'd be looking to show any kind of real gravitas when it matters, and keeping control over their element and really digging their heels in when it matters. There's a reason why you have specialists on projects, is because they know more than the rest of the team, generally speaking. That's why you're paying them good sums of money. So when a project starts slipping, that's the project manager's problem, and we all see projects.
So do we not have software that deals with all of this, where you come in the morning and
look at boxes? Yeah, of course you do.
Go, oh, I need to deal with this.
Do. But I mean, software is as useless as the people using it, or is it as smart or as good as the people using it? And again, we come back to people. Where construction is a people business. There are so many people that you're speaking to get projects off the ground. So that having a decent project manager, but just generally better project planning. One of the trends that we've seen in, again, more successful projects is not racing to start breaking ground on a project once you've got planning, or even before you've got planning. That's not the game. The game is understanding what you're building before you break ground. So understanding what you're building and how you're going to build it. And that sounds like such a simple thing, but in an ever more complex construction and design arena, that is going to take more time than people would hope that it would do to get it right. And doing that will generally lead you down a more successful path. So better planning and having better milestone and checkpoints to understand if you're getting ahead of yourself and whether you've done everything you need to at that particular point.
That comes back to the price-driven decision-making process, doesn't it? Where people don't perceive value, and there's all the normal sayings and expressions that people have to describe what goes wrong. So if you're building new build, as soon as you've got a snagging list, you're actually into retrofit. Retrofit costs X amount more than building it right first time.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of things going, but I suppose in many ways it's convincing people of the value of that, especially if they're operating within fairly defined lines. If all you're doing is supplying the plasterboard onto the job, then you don't give a toss about everything else. If I'm honest. It's just a matter of get it there, make sure it's not damaged, get paid on time.
Of course.
But
of course.
This, I mean, I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is how much of a because it's slightly different, but common sense. We see lots of people bring us ideas. They're not just products. We do get service ideas as well, and an awful lot of them just make sense. But you kind of know, your instinct kind of tells you this is going to be a real bun fight to get going. Okay, because you're up against all this entrenched behaviour, all this sunk cost bias that goes on with people. Just change is too difficult. But it seems to me that if following the story from when you started to now, you actually have managed to deal with that change process the whole way through. And even though it's incremental and a bit slower, you've actually managed to do it. Do you think, is this baked into the system, this kind of resistance to change or this inability to adopt newer and better ideas? Is it baked in? And if it is, where does it start? Does it start on paper with someone going, I've got this problem to solve. Let's just, quick example. It's often easier to use an example. If you want to increase the fire resistance of a particular building element from say 30 minutes to 60 minutes, you can do it. You can do it in a number of ways. But one of the easy ways you can do it is just change what it's made of. Okay. But again, designing a whole building that would behave differently in fire is not just about elemental changes. No. It's about fundamental. It's about design and perception, isn't it?
Well, I think to answer your question, buildings are not cheap. Buildings are expensive things. It's not like you're choosing, I've got this paper clip and I'm trying to figure out if there's a better way of clipping paper together. And if I make 10 mistakes, it's not going to cost me hundreds of thousands of pounds to do that. Whereas, often when people are building, well, almost every time when people are building a building, it's either their life savings, you've got an investor that wants to see return on their money. It's a serious chunks of money. So nobody wants to see unnecessary risk because you're like trying something new. Nobody wants to be a guinea pig. There are a few people that don't mind it, but 99.9% of people building buildings and are involved in that, it's just too much risk.
They don't want to be pioneers.
Exactly. And that's, I get that. I get that. We all have days like that where you just, I say, you either don't want to put the effort into changing something or you just think it's too risky. And the construction industry, compared to a lot of other industries, has been slow and continues to be. It is changing, but continues to be slow at adopting and learning and making progress. The industry is now ripe for that change, and there's a lot of incredible things happening. But there are lots of stakeholders involved. There's, generally speaking, a lot at risk, if depending on your definition of risk, and that's why people are reticent to change. And it's costing more money to make some of these changes, and that's a big no-no as far as a lot of people are concerned.
Go back to the beginning of the conversation. You had your wonder salesman. Okay. So, I think this is a trust issue. Do you have a wonder salesman who's selling things which you describe as being new to the market from overseas? So, all the DIN plates on there and all the instructions are in German and they've got to be translated into English. and yet he was managed to sell it. The reason he sold it to them was principally because he won their trust.
Absolutely. Yeah,
And
that is it. That
and
is
I
it.
don't know. I mean, I think this is one of the issues I have with data per se and technical selling is that there are key people in this in the decision to build a building, probably most importantly, which would be the person who's paying for it, whose trust you need to win. And I'm not entirely sure that it's won by the use of technical selling. I bet your guy who was selling the heating systems wasn't selling it to them on a 100% technical basis. So
no, I don't think he ever waved a data sheet in front of them to make them
no, he probably didn't.
a sale.
It's how much is it? When can I have it? What happens if it goes wrong? Those are the really key questions that people ask, aren't they?
Yeah.
Do you think? Do you think as a sector that is, in particular, architects, specifiers, and technical providers, consultants like yourself, do you think you focus enough on trust as an element of this?
Yes.
Or you just simply want to justify everything with a line on a spreadsheet?
No. I mean, I think from the very conception of mesh and just me personally, just the way that I my personal values, trust is a massive part of me interacting with somebody. I trust a lot of people that I deal with implicitly, and it's for them to show that they're not trustworthy than the other way around. Some people will come at an interaction from I can't trust this person. It's for them to build that trust. I usually come at it from the other way around because humans, generally speaking, are incredibly trustworthy. It's just the odd bad egg that you kind of come across. But from a commercial point of view, we're in the business of, we're in the business of data to a large part, but communications, talking to different stakeholders. But without any trust, I mean, we deal a huge amount with architects. A lot of our work is brought to by architects. Now, architects are not going to bring us business, certainly not more than once, if they don't believe in, well, have seen some great results, don't trust that we can deal with clients, maybe some tricky ones, they've been struggling with. And so for longevity of business and relationships, without trust, you haven't got that. And that kind of may seem obvious, but it's incredible how far you can go and commercially how successful you can be if trust is at the center of what you're doing, whether you're making something, whether you're doing consultancy and all those other kinds of things. But it's a big part of what Mesh is about.
It's the same thing, isn't it? I mean, with your consultancy, for people to understand your competencies is absolutely essential for them to know that you can do the job.
Yeah.
But that's only a proportion of what they're buying, because the rest of it is they're buying the trust in the form of the brand and what you deliver. And I think this is one of the. I don't think there's enough people involved in the practice of behavioural science in construction. I think we're all missing a trick here when it comes to trying to manage change on a broader scale. I think we're all used to. You mentioned earlier on people buy expensive things. You can buy a really expensive watch. I mean, how much does a mobile phone cost these? And you're talking about $1,000 if you're buying it yourself. Unless you buy. So we're used to spending good money on good things. But what we do is we understand what the technology can do to us to a degree that matters, and we trust the people we're buying it from or the brand that we're buying. And I think that when you look at phones, cars, all sorts of other things which are high value purchases, people spend a good deal of time looking at the behavioral psychology side of this. They look at the psychology, which is the right first time. And I mean, there's the Get It Right Institute as well, isn't there? There are other people who are looking at this, which is if you adjust and change the frame of reference, if you give people a different point from which they are anchored, then their decision-making process changes. Because, I mean, a U value is a U value. Once it's calculated, it's a deterministic process. You put the numbers in, that's the bloody result. Okay. What do you do with it? So kind of the interpretation of data. So what are you seeing next for Mesh? Where are we going next with what you do?
So, I mean, as far as Mesh, I mean, there's, it is, I'm hoping is where the industry is going to go. We'll try and affect our little bit of change on that where possible. But I think there are huge gains to be had now with kind of technology kind of coming into the space. Not so much about around materials. I mean, materials are changing rapidly within the construction space, but our focus will be around technology. You haven't got to go very far now without talking about AI, artificial intelligence. And we're looking at how we can work that into, allow to people to get more, bang for their buck, essentially get answers quicker, more in-depth, robust answers, explore different opportunities on projects as a result. But the big thing for us, and again, this is where Mesh has come from, and this is where we've evolved, is integrated building design. Building design now through the stages is about spinning a lot of plates and understanding the interrelations when you change a particular element of the design. And where we're driving is to make that less and less and less clunky, get really solid answers and very, very rapidly. And for us, that becomes a massive game changer because that then starts reducing the cost and very quickly, and I would argue it's already happening, you can do more using that methodology than building traditionally. So you get a better building, you've explored more of the options, you're spending your money more effectively than the way you did it 3 years ago on your last building project, just because you're leveraging technology and the way that you share information from a design point of view. And of course, then you've got more time to spend communicating that effectively, human to human, and within the design team.
Well, we've been going for nearly the full time, and at the end of all of these ones, Doug, as you know, I ask you three questions.
Yeah.
One is to recommend a good read, which I recommend it. Right First Time by Doug Johnson is I'll recommend one for you. But have you got anything that you've read that's kind of changed the way, shift your perspective? Is really the way.
Yeah, so this is going to be a bit left field actually, and you probably expect me to, reel off one of the top 100 books that we've all probably heard of before. But actually, a real game changer for me was we've all heard of Netflix, right? TV streaming, very very successful American streaming business. They wrote back in 2019 a culture deck, which was completely different than anybody else had ever released, as far as we're aware, in the kind of the commercial space. And it was after having read that, and there's a couple of books on Netflix culture, that really set us and our team onto a completely new trajectory. And a few years ago, we came out with a culture deck as a business ourselves. That's on the website to download and have a look. But the one that Netflix did, again, being very, very open about some of the way that the culture's run was a big one for me. So that was more kind of team and business focused than kind of sustainability technical focused.
It's interesting because it's that's an entirely behavioral document.
Yeah.
My second question to you is one piece of advice, not the kind of thing that you can glean from self-help books or the like, or that you would normally learn on an architect's course. But one little bit of advice that you kind of happened across, one little nugget that you would like to pass on to anybody else involved in business.
So again, I thought hard about this. Really, to make any kind of progress, to really move the needle, if you want to get ahead, make more than just incremental change. You've actually got to risk something. And it took me quite a while to understand that. If you risk nothing, not a lot changes. We've all taken risks in our personal lives, in our professional lives, and we will know which of those were scary at the time, but actually got us looking back. And for me, that's the biggest takeaway, understanding that sometimes you just don't know, but you've got to take that risk because you believe enough that it's going to get you somewhere. And even if it doesn't quite get you where you were hoping to, you'll have moved on enough. And it's those chunks which really separate you and get you moving further and faster. You've got to risk something you care about.
It also demonstrates to people, I suppose, that you have a go a managed, a controlled, have a go, we'll look at it.
Yeah, you got to put something on the line. Where that, how much you put on that line is entirely up to
And then
you.
I suppose the other thing with this is that everybody underestimates the value of luck. Actually, this has been measured in economic terms. And of course, what any sensible business will do, will take the luck and then we'll post rationalize it and then put it down to clever thinking beforehand. The last one really was about any shifts in or moments in your career or business that changed the course of the work.
Yes, this is.
I think there's a few for you, but I'm just intrigued which one you might pick.
Yes, this. I mean, this is a dead easy one. Again, maybe not one that has come across your mind well, but from when I started Mesh, I didn't want it just to be me. I wanted a really effective team which could, bring something new and really, really valuable to the market. And my thinking here that kind of created the shift was that I didn't need to do it all. I needed to build a team that could be fantastic, not build a team that made me look fantastic. And step aside, when great people were capable of great things, and support them. And that for me has been massively liberating. And the team members, and they know who they are, have really kind of stepped up, and that's great because the business becomes this kind of self-sustaining organism which doesn't need me at the top prodding and poking all the time, and I don't need all the gratitude. I don't need to be top dog. I just need to be the guy that's kind of cajoling it along every so often, but I'm not making it successful.
Doug, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for all your insights. It's been really, really interesting. And I just look forward to seeing everybody on our next episode of Thinking Aloud. So just finally for me to say, Doug Johnson from Mesh Energy, thank you very much indeed for being on Thinking Aloud.
Cheers. Thanks, Will. Thanks, guys.